June 22nd, 2007. At a WWE live event in Texas, former World Heavyweight Champion Chris Benoit would wrestle his final match against Elijah Burke. Every wrestler who steps foot in the ring one day wrestles their final match. Many times, they go out with a grand finale, a celebration of their career. Other times, their careers are cut short by injuries, preventing them from finishing their time in the squared circle on their own terms. But for Chris Benoit, and for the world of pro wrestling and WWE, there would be no celebration. Instead, his final match would be overshadowed by the horrific events that would take place over the following days. On June 25th, 2007, the bodies of Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel were found in their Georgia home. Shock and sadness filled the world of pro wrestling. Tributes were held not just by fans, but fellow wrestlers, as the following Monday Night Raw was made into a tribute show to Chris Benoit. However, investigators soon uncovered a devastating truth. On June 27th, 2007, investigators ruled that Chris Benoit had taken the lives of Nancy and Daniel before taking his own, all over the course of a few days. What happened? This is the darkest day in pro wrestling history, and the legacy left behind by Chris Benoit. Before we look at the crime committed by Chris, it's important to look at the man himself and his time in the ring. I won't be covering the entire history of Chris Benoit's career as a wrestler. If you would like a more in-depth look, I recommend you take a look at Cultaholic Wrestling's video, Rabid, the Chris Benoit story. Chris Benoit was born in Montreal, Canada, on May 21st, 1967. At a young age, Chris was infatuated with professional wrestling, and one wrestler in particular, Tom Billington, otherwise known by his ring name, the Dynamite Kid, who is by all accounts one of the most talented wrestlers of all time, and who himself was no stranger to controversy. Chris idolized Billington and started his path to the ring in high school, and would later train under Stu Hart in the Hart family dungeon. Beginning in Stampede Wrestling in 1985, Benoit would begin honing his craft and achieved moderate success before moving to New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1986. During his time here, he began wrestling under the name The Pegasus Kid, and in 1990 won his first major championship, the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship. It was here in New Japan, and in a few minor promotions afterward, where Benoit would truly fine-tune his technique and skills before moving to WCW, or World Championship Wrestling, in 1992. Between 1992 and 1994, Benoit would work with multiple promotions, including Paul Heyman's ECW, or Extreme Championship Wrestling, where he would continue working, being involved in notable feuds, including one against ECW legend Sabu. In 1995, Benoit would return to WCW and would spend the following 5 years in the company. But by 1999, Benoit was unhappy working in WCW, even though they would crown Benoit with the vacant WCW World Championship at the time, along with his close friends Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn. Benoit left World Championship Wrestling shortly after. Near the end of WWE, at the time WWF's Attitude Era, Benoit would join the company. And this is where most people remember Benoit from. His time in WWE saw he and his friend Eddie Guerrero become fan favorites, with Eddie's high-flying style and charismatic heel personality winning over many, and Benoit's savage technical style and no-nonsense personality appealing to the hardcore fans. Benoit and Guerrero would see success between the ropes in the first few years of their WWE tenure, with Benoit winning the tag team titles, the Intercontinental title, and the United States Championship. In 2004, however, Benoit would be put on track for his most famous run in WWE. At the 2004 Royal Rumble, Benoit outlasted 29 other superstars, entering at number 1 to win the match and earn a world title match at WrestleMania 20. Benoit would move to Raw and announce that he would challenge the World Heavyweight Champion, Triple H, at WrestleMania. After some hijinks, courtesy of Shawn Michaels, the match at WrestleMania 20 in the main event would be Triple H versus Chris Benoit versus Shawn Michaels in a triple threat match for the World Championship. In a true feel-good story moment, Benoit would go on to win the match, celebrating in the ring with his best friend Eddie, who on the same night retained the WWE Championship. A monumental chapter in a great wrestling story. During his reign as champion, Benoit would also win the tag team titles with Edge before dropping them the following May. Of course, Benoit would eventually lose the championship months later at SummerSlam, dropping the title to Randy Orton. After losing the world title, Benoit would begin taking a backseat as newer stars like John Cena and Batista began taking center stage. In 2005, Benoit would win the United States Championship after being drafted to SmackDown, before losing the title to Booker T in October. While Benoit wasn't exactly seen as the top guy in the company at this point, and he would never reach the heights that he did at WrestleMania 20, Benoit was still considered one of the most reliable and hardworking members of the roster. Unfortunately, things would take a tragic turn in the following month. On November 13th, 2005, Eddie Guerrero was found passed away in his hotel room. The following evening, Monday Night Raw held an Eddie Guerrero tribute show. Many superstars were devastated, giving touching tributes to their fallen colleague. However, no one was more devastated on this show than Chris Benoit, who was in tears, sobbing uncontrollably, barely able to deliver his heartbreaking message to Eddie, the man he considered his closest friend in the world, and someone who changed his life. Many people close to Benoit, such as Chavo Guerrero, have stated that Chris wasn't the same after Eddie died, that he wasn't the same Chris that they knew before. The same week on SmackDown, Chris Benoit defeated Triple H in an Eddie Guerrero tribute match. The match concluded with Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, and Triple H all pointing to the sky in a salute to Eddie. In the following months, Benoit would feud with guys like Randy Orton and Booker T before capturing the US Championship again at February 14th's No Way Out pay-per-view in 2006. He would capture the title one final time in October 2006 before dropping it the following May in 2007 at WWE's Judgment Day pay-per-view. Shortly after, Chris Benoit would be moved from SmackDown to WWE's ECW brand as part of the 2007 WWE Draft. This would be Benoit's final month in the WWE, and after a few small feuds and wrestling his final match against Elijah Burke, Chris Benoit was set to compete against CM Punk at WWE's Vengeance pay-per-view, where he would have won the vacant ECW Championship. And this is where Chris Benoit's wrestling journey ends. In the days before WWE's Vengeance pay-per-view, Chris Benoit missed the weekend house shows, telling WWE officials that his wife and son were extremely sick with food poisoning. And when he failed to show up at the Vengeance pay-per-view, viewers were informed that Chris missed the show due to a family emergency. It wouldn't be until days later that the news would break as to the real reason for Benoit's absence. I won't go into full details of Benoit's actions, as this video is not meant to focus on the actions themselves, but the legacy left behind. But I will provide an overview of what happened. Over a 3-day period between June 22nd and June 24th, 2007, Chris Benoit took the life of his wife, Nancy, via strangulation. Following this, Chris sedated his son, Daniel, before taking the 7-year-old's life by suffocation. Over the following day and a half, Benoit would leave voice messages and texts for multiple individuals, including Chavo Guerrero, who would later report that Benoit sounded groggy and was concerned about his demeanor. Finally, Chris Benoit would take his own life, hanging himself in his private workout room. On Monday, June 25, 2007, WWE officials contacted the Fayetteville Police Department and requested a welfare check for the Benoit household. Police were dispatched and discovered the crime scene. Around 4:15 p.m., WWE officials were notified of the tragedy. Though a tribute show to Benoit was held on Raw that evening, the following days would reveal the truth about what Chris Benoit did. And following these events, Chris Benoit would not be mentioned on WWE television, aside from a statement from Vince McMahon about the subject. Ever since that day, Chris Benoit has effectively been blacklisted, erased from WWE. His accomplishments and impact on the industry taking a far back seat because of the severity of his actions. What happened? What caused Chris Benoit to do something so awful? It's important, first of all, to remember that answers to questions in cases like these are rarely simple. One factor could be that behind the scenes, Chris and Nancy had many troubles. Among these included drug abuse, possible domestic abuse, alcohol abuse, and a possible affair between Chris and another female wrestler. Nancy had actually filed for divorce from Chris in 2003, but withdrew it 3 months later. Another factor many point to is the passing of Chris's best friend, Eddie. People who knew Chris best have repeatedly stated how much Eddie's death impacted Chris and changed him. Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit were by all accounts as close as friends could be. Losing someone so close to you in a business as grueling as professional wrestling is no doubt something that will leave a major impact on you. However, the two biggest factors that experts point to as the most likely cause of Chris's actions are repeated drug abuse, which Chris was well known for struggling with, just the same as Eddie Guerrero and many wrestlers, and repeated, untreated injuries. In a business that has you throwing your body around 300 plus days a year, taking bumps and traveling constantly, all while requiring you to be in peak physical shape, it's no wonder why so many wrestlers in the past have fallen prey to prescription drug abuse and steroid usage. And while WWE has indeed made great strides since then in enforcing their wellness policy, it was unfortunate that it took a tragedy like this to really open the public's eye to the dangers of drugs in sports entertainment. As for his injuries, neuroscientist and former wrestler Christopher Nowinski argued that Benoit may have suffered from multiple untreated concussions from his time in the ring. One of Chris Benoit's finishing moves was a diving headbutt from the ring ropes, which no doubt caused some damage. And according to Nowinski, Chris was one of the few wrestlers who would take chair shots directly to the back of the head, which is highly unsafe. Pro wrestling may be predetermined, and the wrestlers are taught how to take impacts and shots from objects in a way to minimize the risk of injury and keep each other safe in the ring. Above all else, pro wrestling is entertainment and performance. But many wrestlers are known for pushing the envelope and blurring the lines between spectacle and blood sport, such as ECW legend New Jack or WWE Hall of Famer Mick Foley. It's nearly undeniable that these repeated impacts to the head, combined with drug abuse and emotional trauma, were all major factors in why Chris did what he did. When his brain was examined after the fact by the head of neurosurgery Julian Bales at West Virginia University, it was reported that Benoit's brain was so severely damaged that it resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Other tests on his brain tissue revealed severe CTE and damage to all 4 lobes and his brainstem. If you're unaware, repeated damage and concussions to your brain can result in major behavioral and personality changes, and even dementia. If all of this wasn't enough, according to Benoit's sister-in-law in 2013, she was told by the medical examiner that Chris Benoit's heart was enlarged up to 3 times the size of a normal human heart at the time of his death, and that he was likely on his way to death within 10 months had the events of that day not taken place. Whether Chris himself was aware of this is unknown. All of these factors seem to have combined to form a perfect storm that ultimately led to Chris snapping and committing these terrible deeds. While a note from Benoit was eventually found at the scene, it does not shed much light onto the reasons for his actions. And in the end, only Chris truly knows why he did what he did. And those reasons are lost along with him. Nowadays, Chris Benoit is still rarely, if ever, brought up officially by WWE, though wrestlers sometimes mention him outside of televised appearances and official events. When he is talked about, you can see that it is a difficult subject for everyone involved. Some, like former WWE stars Kurt Angle and Chavo Guerrero, still hold fond memories of their time with Benoit in the ring, and many refer to him as one of the greatest technical wrestlers of all time. Others, however, like Paul Heyman, recognize that his accomplishments are overshadowed by what he did. As stated by Heyman, "You can admire his work all you want, but I'll give you my take. 3 people died in that house that night. Only one person had the choice behind it." And even though many fans still hold hope that Benoit's contributions could one day be honored with his induction into the WWE Hall of Fame, Stone Cold Steve Austin summed up the situation best when he stated, "One night, Chris ended up killing his wife and his kid. That is an act so terrible and horrible, I can't even comprehend or guess as to what happened in that house. That will always overshadow any accomplishment Chris had in the ring. He'll never be in the Hall of Fame. It will just never happen. His career will speak for itself, but his record as a human being is first and foremost, and those actions will never be forgotten. That's my feelings on that. We don't even need to talk about the Hall of Fame. Speaking for myself, Chris Benoit as the person I knew, loved him. Chris Benoit as a wrestler, loved him. Chris Benoit as the person who did what he did, unforgivable. Bottom line." I started watching WWE long after the events of that day, and never saw Benoit in the ring until I watched some of his career highlights and did my research on the man and his impact in the world of professional wrestling. And the way I look at it is this. Chris Benoit was undoubtedly an extremely talented performer, one whose accomplishments and career are worthy of acknowledgement. However, it goes without saying that no matter his in-ring accomplishments, and no matter how beloved he was at one time, there is no possible way to overlook his horrific actions. I look at the story of Chris Benoit as a tragic and cautionary tale. A tale of what happens when the industry a man devoted his whole life to slowly chips away at him, changing him. And what happens when that man breaks. Pro wrestling is entertainment. It's fun. It provides joy and fun to millions of people. It transcends generations. It's the closest thing we have to seeing real-life superheroes battling for our entertainment. But there is a darker side to pro wrestling. The loss, the injuries, the scandals. And we must never forget that this sport, that many deride as fake, can unfortunately become all too real in the worst ways imaginable.